Amanda. Thanks for being on the podcast. You got school starting next week. I have teacher meetings starting next week. So we're kind of on opposite ends. Well, actually, not opposite ends because I'm sending off writers from high school to then go to the freshman 101 English class. So any complaints that you have about the preparedness of college freshmen is probably my fault as a high school teacher.
Yeah, I'll know exactly where to direct my ire, and it'll be you specifically. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And as we know, all you need is one example that you can then paint the entire profession with the broad stroke. Yeah. So because you know you have one face to look at for the high school English, that applies to everybody. Everybody teaches English like that. I'm the overall disappointment.
Yeah, when they come in and they know nothing about grammar or sentence structure or anything like that, I'll know exactly who to think about. I'll be like, Jeff.
This is a very Lundian thing. You can turn my name into a verb, and it can be terrible. But
that might be helpful. You'll be my scapegoat.
Perfect.
Everyone needs a scapegoat.
Absolutely. So, how'd you get into to teaching? We'll start there for a little bit. Why do you want to take this position? Then we'll kind of move backwards chronologically to the firefighting.
Yeah. Well, this sort of came about because I applied to grad school at the University of Montana in the MFA program, and I'm pursuing creative nonfiction, and I'll be working with my advisor is Chris Dombrowski, who's kind of somebody I've looked up to as a fly fishing writer over the last 10 years or so that I've been writing about fly fishing specifically. So applied to this program. I got in, and I'm going to kind of offset some of my tuition, most of my tuition with, actually all of my tuition with teaching. And so I have taught very little in the past. I've taught, I taught WFR classes, so like wilderness first responder classes for a couple years, and that scared the ever-living shit out of me. Like I remember at one point I had the students learning about taking vitals, and they would take vitals on me, and I remember at one point my blood pressure was like, it was like 160 over like 110 or something. I don't remember, but it was like unbelievably high because I was unbelievably stressed about this. And so I honestly feel like that job in particular, I got all my anxiety out teaching in that job. And now this doesn't feel like necessarily a breeze, but I think it'll be fun to be in front of a class and to be teaching about something that I actually feel very confident in, or fairly confident in teaching, because I've just, I've been writing for 15, 20 years at this point. So I feel a lot more confident teaching that topic than first responder.
Yeah.
So
I'm not a neuroscientist, but I do understand some of the basics of the neurochemicals and whatnot. So when you're talking about that anxiety that you might get when you're in a nervous situation, your body is flooded with cortisol, and in some cases that makes people debilitated. They can't function, they freeze, or they have the crippling anxiety. In other instances, it can turn into like a real source of like positive energy in the moment. So thinking back to your wildfire days, how were you able to kind of control the neurochemicals in your brain and turn it from a potentially debilitating fear of the potential? It's obviously risky, there's dangers. How were you able to turn that into something that would allow you to be functional? And is that something that you were kind of born with? Or do you think you were able to develop that trait to be able to function in those high intense situations?
That is such a good question. I think a lot about my time in fire as having gotten me sort of addicted to cortisol, because it is really kind of a roller coaster of a hormone that you experience in wildfire, where you kind of ramp up early in the summer. You're sort of ramping up your cortisol output because you're starting to prepare for the season, and you're going out on prescribed fires, and you're sort of like, getting prepared. And then you're out on incidents all summer long where you almost get like numb to cortisol, into like what it should be doing for you, which is like giving you a healthy fear of the very real risk that you're, in. And I'm also not a neuroscientist, so I don't know exactly how this all works. All I know is that I would be high on cortisol all summer because I was stressed out. I mean, there was nothing about it. I was not immune to the anxiety of the job. A lot of the people I was around were, and it's very much just it's like a matter of exposure therapy almost. Like by the time I got on what's called a hotshot crew, which is kind of like a crew that you expect to be out on fires on, or you expect to be out on fire like kind of all summer. You're like if you don't have a summer where you get 1,000 hours of overtime, you consider that a bad year in
Mm.
the hot shotting world. Whereas my previous 2 summers of starting out, I was getting 400, I think, one summer, and we got like 600 one summer. So, and then my first season of hot shotting, we got like over 1,000 hours overtime, which again, that's like sort of the metric used to explain it was a really busy summer. And so I had been exposed to a certain extent to some of these anxieties for a couple seasons. And then I got on a hot shot crew and I was like, oh, this is like a daily thing that I am going to have to learn how to deal with. And I remember my first assignment just being scared shitless. Like genuinely, I was like losing sleep at night because I was so scared because the level of risk just increased so much getting on this type of crew specifically. We were working under dead trees a lot, dead burned over trees. We were working in really steep terrain where like rolling rocks were like a constant hazard. We weren't on like super duper active fires, but what I quickly found was that rolling rocks, like falling trees, those are the things that actually kill firefighters. And so, burnovers are very relatively rare in the grand scheme of like how firefighters actually die, which is largely vehicle accidents and trees falling.
Mm.
So I remember one day we were walking out of the line in New Mexico on my first fire assignment, my first full fire assignment as a hot shot, and the whole crew was lined out. We walk in a line. And we stopped because we saw this tree that looked like it was burning at the base and that it might be a risk to walk under. And we stopped kind of under it. And our crew boss went up to, or like our superintendent and some of our captains went up to look at it. And they like leaned on it. And as they leaned on it to look up at the canopy, it was a green tree that just happened to be burning at the base. It like fell, and it fell directly in the line of like the entire crew,
Oh
22
man.
of us. And we all scattered like ants. And like a few of us went to the right and everyone else went to the left. I went to the right. And I remember one of my coworkers who was like a combat vet anyway, he was like, go left. And we like turned around and like went left. And of course the tree fell like kind of right where we were going. And like nobody said anything. Like we almost had like some injuries from this tree, if not worse. And we just didn't talk about it. It was just like, yep, okay, we're going to keep walking out. And I was like, what? And so like grappling with that was like that was like the first week that I was on like my first real hot fire assignment with a hot shot crew. I was like, okay, my standards need to change, and that's terrifying. And then we thankfully didn't have really anything as intense as that happen for the rest of the summer. But for like fully a week of that summer, I was like, we're just going to be dealing with this like unbelievable risk every single day. And like nobody cares. Like nobody is saying anything about it. And at a certain point though, you just begin to trust your supervisors, and you know that they have a lot of experience, and that you can trust that they have this experience that is, like helps you not be in bad situations.
Mm-hmm.
But the cortisol thing, I mean, it's really interesting to think about, because I feel like I did get addicted to cortisol through fire. And then in the winters, this is a very common experience in the wildfire community, is that you become deeply, deeply depressed because you are not getting these shots of cortisol that are associated with, being in these high stress environments where you're not only stressed mentally, but you're also stressed obviously physically and really emotionally in many cases. And then you just lose that. And, that's probably a good thing. You can't live like that all the time. But then lacking that cortisol and like these hormones, you end up just in like kind of the pits of despair in the winter. And it was a roller coaster. And I am so glad I'm off of it. It took me years to sort of undo that relationship with anxiety and of being in high stress environments to like feel good, because it did feel good when you could get through a summer and be like, I just did so much, and I just got through so much fear, and I did it even when I was scared. I did this thing, and I'm so proud of myself. But like another part of that is just what that's doing to your brain, and how it did take me like 2 or 3 years to deconstruct how my brain was like genuinely addicted to cortisol. Yeah.
In my adventure survival literature class, we talk about the difference between when you get addicted to that amp. Sometimes that's in a non-productive form. So it's just, I want to go off a higher jump, or I want to do something more extreme. So I get that. but as far as overall benefiting anything, it doesn't really, except for temporarily benefit you in that moment, versus the cortisol or the amp that you get from being productive member of the community. So
Mm.
kind of connecting that to wildfire, you have extreme sports type people. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Like, that's great, it's entertainment, you can make your living doing what you love, there's nothing at all wrong with that. But were there times when you reminded yourself that I'm doing something that's really, really important, so I can endure this a little bit, or this is one of the downsides, this is one of the consequences of having a role that's so important to the community, it's going to be worth it, or I want to keep talking about it? So how did you manage that purpose in the community piece?
Yeah, I think you're overestimating like how I saw my role in that. I mean, I hate to admit it. I think it's important to admit though, I think a lot of firefighters would relate that fighting fire is a deeply like egotistical
Mm,
act. Like you're doing it because you're like, I have the fitness, I have the interest, and I have this what I believe to be the stamina and the resilience to withstand this really difficult job. And it's like the most difficult job you can imagine. Like you think about jobs that you can sort of easily access to like test your own resilience, and that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind. And I had a number of friends that did it. And something I see a lot on like the wildfire Reddit that I still follow just because it's interesting to stay up on culture is you have these people coming in that are like, I'm a computer science major in college, or like I'm a software engineer in California and I really want to get into wildfire. And it really does. It's like, yes, the purpose and like the contribution to society is important, but it's often a secondary thought, I would say. Like, I would say by and large, that is the case for firefighting, is that that's not the reason, that's not like the sole reason people are getting into this. They're getting into it for that challenge. Eventually, they realize, like, oh, this is really beneficial. And maybe I can be a better benefit to society if I move into a different realm in the wildfire space, or like maybe this really is where my purpose lies, like using my body to prevent wildfire impacts to communities. But I do think that initial instinct of why people get into this job is deeply egotistical
mm.
in a way. And like I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I do sort of feel that way about especially wildland firefighting.
Mhm.
And I don't know that a lot of people like would admit that, but that's just kind of my experience. That being said, I think like so that never really came up for me, like, oh, like I'm using my body, or maybe it did. I guess like I am using my cortisol high for like a better reason than just like this vanity of like getting better at biking or whatever. But I found that ultimately biking and running and endurance sports and jumping, like going off progressively like larger cliffs, that to say, like when I say a larger cliff skiing especially, I mean like from like 2 feet to like 3 feet. That stuff like is what has sort of healed my cortisol, my
Mm,
relationship with cortisol in many ways, because I'm like, this feels way more controllable. I can approach this in my own way. It's not like I'm being like, in many cases it felt like I was sort of being forced into these situations on fire crews where I was like, I don't feel particularly safe. I don't know if I shouldn't feel safe because I don't know enough about fire to know if we're in a bad spot or not, because I was only 4 years. I only did 4 years, and so I had enough context to know certain things, but oftentimes I didn't have enough context to understand, especially early on, like, am I at risk? Should
mm,
I be scared? My supervisors aren't scared, and the people that have been doing this for a long time aren't scared. So I feel like maybe I could just inform my own emotions from them. But in outdoor sports, which has been my way of sort of coming back to myself and my body after just using it for manual labor for so long, it's nice to have control over where I push it and where I don't, and where I'm like, oh, I don't I have some self-preservation instincts, and I don't want to push beyond that. I don't want to make myself feel like I have to go off this bigger drop on my mountain bike just because I feel like I have to always be progressing. Like,
mhm,
no. So I do think I have like bigger thoughts about tapping into the outdoor community, especially in like that progression and like that desire to use their body and that desire to like seek resilience through these endurance activities, and how that can be sort of maybe like a proxy, or rather like it can be connected to more volunteerism in sort of forest, or in like forest stewardship or landscape stewardship, or going out and doing more like helping do thinning on like, local your local, what am I trying to say? Like just like helping with like local stewardship projects and like
Right.
using that desire to be in the woods and like hanging out with your friends and using your resilience in some meaningful way. Like you can hopefully like it would be cool to get to a place where we can open up more opportunities for those people to find stewardship work in their community to do, whether
Right.
that's trail work or like thinning or like helping with prescribed burn associations. I just think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of lines that we can kind of adopt and then just preach. The teaching profession is like that too. I'm going to speak to that because that's what I'm most familiar with. But we can say, oh, teaching is a calling and teachers are heroes and this and that. And a lot of teachers got into teaching because it was just available. That was when I was in high school. I said I'd never be a teacher, and now here I'm a teacher. And it wasn't because I finally discovered my calling. It was an opportunity, and so I took the opportunity. And I was taking night classes on how to be a teacher while I was teaching on an emergency credential. So it wasn't like a lifelong passion. But then, as you start to teach, you start to think, this actually there's some downsides to this. This sucks, and then you think, someone has to do this. There have to be people who care in this role. And so I think that's where it can maybe transition from just an opportunity, something to do, something to make money into, okay, now I'm feeling that purpose a little bit because someone need this. This is an important role in our community. I'm not getting paid well, but it's still going to be worth it. And then looking for other opportunities as you go forward there. You
Yeah.
were talking a little bit about being part of your community. And in a podcast you did, I don't know if it was the last one with Kelly Ramsey, you were talking about the minutia in it can be super annoying, and if you make mistakes while you're out there, it can be devastating to your psyche, and you can feel ashamed and you can feel embarrassed. But what role did the attention to detail, even though it was horrible and mortifying, how did that kind of increase the value of the experience? Can you speak a little bit about that? How it had
Yeah.
a deeper meaning?
Yeah, I'd love to. And I think the biggest part of it is that it humbled me and it made me, because, like, again, like you get into it because you're like, I want to prove myself. And not because, but not like solely because, but that's a big part of like the psyche when you get into these jobs is like, especially as a woman, you're like, I have to prove myself, like I have to be a contributing member of this team because like what is the point otherwise? Like I'm not here just yeah, I'm here to contribute. I'm here to be meaningful member of this crew. And so you don't want to be last on every hike. You don't want to be like the weakest person in like all of the you have to do like a certain number of push-ups and pull-ups and sit-ups and stuff at the beginning of the season in this fitness test. And so you want to be able to say like I am as fit or as strong as the guys are and maybe it's not like the top guys, but yeah, whatever. You want to be there. You want to show that you want to be there. And then, as a rookie on one of these crews, they knock you down really quick. They're like, yeah, okay, you've earned your place. You've done the fitness testing. You've made it on the crew. Now you're going to be sort of indoctrinated into how we run things. And it's going to be very different from any other crew you've been on. And also it's going to be very different from what you would expect. And it maybe won't make sense sometimes. They never tell you that, but it just like didn't make sense sometimes. I was like, what do you mean? Like, you guys never told me this was even a rule, and now I did something that is making the entire buggy have to do 20 push-ups, and I didn't even know I was doing something wrong. And they're like, well, now you know. And it's like, damn it, okay. And so it's humbling. It was like deeply humbling because they like knock your ass down before you get a chance to think you're hot shit. They're like, nope. And then they have all this minutia that I think when you're first starting out, you're like, I can't keep up on all of these things that I'm supposed to be, all of these standards I'm supposed to be meeting. And then eventually, because they drill it into you via making you do push-ups, making you and your entire squad do push-ups if you do it wrong, about a month into the season, 2 months into the season, you're like, oh, I am dialed. Like I'm getting it. I'm not doing anything wrong anymore. They're not making me do push-ups anymore. And I feel like much more close with my squad. I feel much more like dialed in. I feel much more part of the crew. And it it all it all I guess the way that I justified it in my mind, because I was a mess my first 2 seasons on this crew, I was like, I'm not doing anything right. Everyone hates me. There's no reason I should be here. I'm not a contributing member. I think every rookie on a hotshot crew, unless they have significant experience previous, probably has felt that way where you're like, I am useless. Like, I am a piece of crap and nobody's ever going to respect me on this crew. And then eventually you're like, oh, wait, like I'm here. I have friends on the crew and I'm doing my chores adequately and I'm not getting yelled at every day. And in the process of going through that process, I have like sort of become part of this unit that, like Kelly was saying, it feels as though it's like a life or death situation to be accepted into this unit. Because if you're not accepted, you're spending every day of the summer with these 20 people who don't like you or who like actively don't want you on the crew. And that can feel like super sort of like deeply scary to have that be a reality. So having even a remote amount of acceptance, I had like two good buddies on the crew and we would always be talking and they were always like kind of willing to be vulnerable with me and say when they were struggling or, when they were dealing with issues with their partner at home, like, oh, I really miss them. And I was able to say the same thing. And it was like sort of this like small bond that kind of got me through the summer. Once I had that, I felt like I was like, okay, like I can stop being so stressed out about the cohesion thing. But the way that they maintain that is through these really niche standards that you won't understand unless you've been on a crew and you've been yelled at for not sweeping the floor of the buggy to an adequate level or been yelled at for not taking the garbage out enough, or the tool bin is not to the sort of liking of the squad boss, or you didn't wash the windows well enough at the last or you didn't wash the windows at all at the last gas station stop, or all of these little things that you just kind of have to learn are very important and very important for becoming part of this like well-oiled machine, which is the whole purpose, I think, of these routines and of these rituals almost, is that you have to become part of this machine. And the best way to sort of integrate you into that machine is to like sort of, yeah, just like get you up to that standard and do so by way of almost shaming you into like doing these things that feel so unimportant, but like ultimately are the first step towards building that level of camaraderie and cohesion that's really important to crew safety, like in the actual really impactful moments. I don't know if that's explained very well or if I explained that very well, but that's how I ultimately justified it. Was like they're getting me to this point where the small things are what they're yelling at me about now, but if once I get those small things dialed in and once the rest of the crew does too, like we're going to be operating at like a higher level for those moments that actually matter, for those moments when we need to communicate really well on the line because something's going wrong, or for those moments when we need to like get somebody off the line because they've been injured, which ended up happening at one point on that first summer. So that's, I found that was such a good justification in my mind. That's what I was telling myself early in the summer, was like, they're doing this now and I will be like a more meaningful part of the team later because they're doing this now. And that really helped me get through that.
Yeah, you brought up standards, which is super interesting. If we look back, like, historically, there was always some sort of rite of passage for the youth. They had to go and they had to prove their worth. They had to leave society and they came back to society and they were able to, they had the skills, they had the wherewithal, they had some way that they could participate in the culture. We don't have those cultural rite of passages anymore. We kind of have some social rites of passage, but it seems like culture is increasingly advocating for safety and for just people not having to feel threatened. So, we see it with things like even like coaching and whatnot, where you have an overbearing coach. Well, is this coach overbearing or is this coach just getting the most out of people? So where does it go from we are focusing on the minutia so that we can get a bigger return on our investment and we can function better and I'm going to get the most out of you and we have to be absolutely diligent about this sort of stuff? When does that kind of morph into like the toxic culture? It seems like we've talked so much about everything being toxic that like nothing is toxic because everything is toxic. So how does that balance? Some people would listen to the way I talked about coaching or even teaching or having standards, and in Wildfire too, that, oh, that's a toxic culture because they're going over the top about you not taking out the garbage. So is that something you concern yourself with, or where do you fall on that?
Yeah, that is interesting. And I feel like I should have more or more like articulate thoughts about this. I'm going to try my best.
You
I
also
think
don't have
that,
to. I mean, sometimes we try
yeah,
to to argue with the internet, and it's like it doesn't matter what you say, people are going to find some sort of whatever with it. But I was wondering if you had some interesting
absolutely.
insight or nuance on that.
Yeah, I think like, one thing is just having those standards is really important. And I can understand how you come from a culture where those types of things we don't really have that anymore. And so, like, when you're first starting out on these crews, they really have to sort of like ingrain this, this side of culture that we just don't have a lot of exposure to anymore. This integrating into a team, what that looks like, sort of the rite of passage. In the past, it looked a lot like hazing. Now it's like, I think it can very easily like bridge into hazing. It's very easy for that to happen and obviously into harassment. I think what separated my experience, I never felt like my experience was toxic. I felt like if they had made, if there was any sort of there was never any comment on my identity. It was never like about me being a woman, and I think that that is important. And I think that my crew leadership specifically had a bit of had a bit of historical, or had a bit of what's the word, experience in working with really diverse crews, specifically, bringing in folks that you don't traditionally see represented in the wildfire space. And so it just felt like kind of from day one that like this layer of respect was really inherent in what we were doing. And I thought that was well reflected in, for example, we had a crew member who like wasn't very good at hiking my second season and was almost always last, and not only last, but like was like 5 to 10 minutes behind everyone else. And that's just like a lot of crews would be like, you're gone. And that is maybe not toxic necessarily. It really is like something that you need to do for the safety of the crew. But on our crew, it was like, no, we're going to work with you. And we did. And a lot of crews are kind of moving into that territory of like, if you want to be here, we will work with you to get you where you need to be. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other context for that in terms of like the workforce, and like the workforce is certainly shrinking, and a lot of people on more intense crews would be like, we would never allow that type of thing, and like that's soft or whatever. And I think it all speaks to this broader conversation about like how hard we need to be and how like intense we need to be to get the same outcome as any other crew. And so I think there are a number of hotshot crews in the U.S. right now that are sort of bridging that gap between historic, like really macho, really intense hotshot culture that very much bordered on toxic, if not was outright toxic and like outright harassment. And they're finding ways to, you know, still be really, really strong dialed crews and still have the ability to have the same outcomes and be really, really, well respected on the line for the things that they do, and also really respecting kind of the importance of bringing on more diverse crew members and making those folks feel welcome, and then not having toxicity be the foundation of the way that they integrate people into the crew culture. There's a lot of ways to integrate new crew members into crew culture that are not inherently toxic. It's just that the culture, like the hotshot and wildfire culture for the last 100 years, has very much been founded on that. And so it's just this sort of deconstruction that's happening in real time right now. And some people are kind of holding on to the old ways, thinking that that's like, maybe they're not outright harassing people, but it certainly has a flavor of the old days, of the like, the old guys. But it's cool to see that culture is shifting. I would recommend the work of Ben McLean. I think about Ben when I'm talking about this topic specifically. I'm thinking about how Ben would talk about it, because he's really kind of leading. He's at like the sort of forefront of changing hotshot culture and helping people recognize that you can be a really tough crew and you can do really good work and you can, hang with the best of them, and you can also have like a respectful crew culture that invites different people and celebrates diversity, and that those two things can coexist, because there
Right.
are still a lot of people who don't think those things can coexist, and actually horrifying. So Kelly's book, I think, really, really amplifies this. Another person who I actually interviewed for the podcast, River Selby, they wrote a book about hotshotting, a memoir about hotshotting as well this summer. And their book came out about 2 weeks ago. And both of those books, River identified as a female when she was when they were on a hotshot crew in the early 2000s. And so both of them were able to speak to that experience and how this sort of toxic environment is not ultimately very effective in building, in furthering the workforce.
Mm. And unfortunately, typically it's people who aren't involved in it who are commenting the most on it. So you didn't experience it. You weren't there. You don't know the people. You're just taking a word, a phrase, an idea, and you're just applying it. And you don't have any of the inside information. So it's very difficult to try to help people understand because they don't really want to understand. Yeah, and it could be really frustrating to deal with that. But there's a good match of the standards of the old days without a lot of the extra nonsense that came with it, and then updating that and just seeing people get the most out of themselves. It's pretty inspiring just to see how hard people work. And then when you're part of that, it's a pretty special feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do want to say like the people that I've worked with in fire are like some of the most spectacular humans I've met. And that's why I'm so taken like with the fire community and why I've done the podcast. And all of this is because everyone I've met in that world is like, they are just sort of the best of us. I don't know. I am inspired constantly by how folks that I know who worked in operational fire, for example, have like taken that experience and, worked really hard to like change the culture or to bring their experiences into research, bring their experiences into really important research that's, talking or like, exploring how we can reduce wildfire impacts on vulnerable communities or on, just this wide range of stuff that I've seen these folks doing in the aftermath of their fire careers. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say, like, man, the work that like this career, that career, I should say, not this because I'm not currently doing it, but that career there is so, I don't know what I'm trying to say. I just like, I can't express enough how valuable it was to experience that and to have the opportunity to work with folks like that and to do work on, like work in these beautiful places that I would have never seen otherwise and experience and learn things about myself that I would have never learned had I not been in that job. And part of me is like, I wish everyone could have that experience. And then another part of me is like, but at the same time, I was exposed constantly to extreme levels of wildfire smoke. I was constantly on this cortisol roller coaster that really made me like deeply, deeply depressed in the winters. I like could not hold down a relationship during these summers because I was gone all summer, literally didn't see my partner like at all. So I was like constantly kind of in this sense of just this sense of instability. I think every wildland firefighter would say the same thing. Like I'm what's the word I'm looking for? My health is taking a hit. My relationships are taking a hit. My family life's taking a hit. And I honestly feel like shit in the off season, no matter what I do. And yet I'm still doing it. So like two things can be true at once.
Mm-hmm.
I've found that experience to be extremely valuable. I really wish everyone could have an experience like that where they are able to sort of find themselves and face these really intense feelings and emotions of feeling like you don't belong and then finding yourself, actually belonging in a really high intensity unit or like, crew. I wish everyone could experience that, but like, I wish that they could experience it without all these secondhand impacts.
Yeah, we don't get any of the growth without any adversity, and I feel a little worried for a couple of my graduating seniors every year who are the ones who I don't know how much they've challenged themselves, and so I'm not really sure what level of confidence they really have, and so they kind of equate their GPA to their value. And so if the first time they get a B in college, all of a sudden they have no self-confidence, they haven't had to work. And then now all of a sudden their one thing that was their identity, their GPA number, now that that's gone, what do they have left? Because they've never made it through anything else. And that's a little bit disconcerting. Or kids who like they've been athletes, but it wasn't an experience that really brought the most out of them. It was just kind
Mm.
of participated like it was a club, and it was kind of silly, and they didn't really care about winning and losing. There was no standard. There was nothing for them to kind of bind everybody together and fight for a common goal. And so you're going off as a 19-year-old or an 18-year-old to college, and you've never had to work anything. And so when your high school teacher gave you a B in English, and then you go to a University of Montana and you get a C in your writing 101 class, and you haven't had adversity, you're going to call your mom, and your mom's going to email the TA, and it's her first year being a TA, and there's going to be a mother that's asking, why does my daughter or my son have a C minus in your class?
Hmm.
Brutal.
It is brutal, and I do wonder. Yeah, I mean, like, I wonder. I know. I wish that we didn't need adversity to build confidence, and maybe we don't. I don't know that we necessarily do. A lot of my writing has been was informed by like grief and like experiencing things that felt uniquely difficult at the ages that I was experiencing them. I would say one of the most transformative moments of my life was when my stepmom passed away when I was 23. I was fresh out of college. Here I was, like a writer. I was fresh out of college, and I was like, I'm going to go out west and get a job with a magazine, and I can't wait. And all my friends were going off and doing their thing and getting cool jobs in all these places out west, primarily, whatever they may be. And I was at home watching my stepmom succumb to cancer and helping my dad raise my three little sisters. And and I it was just a deeply transformative point of my life. It was deep. I grieved in a way that I didn't even know was possible. Over the next 2 years, when she had, she passed away in April after I graduated in December, and then I stayed home for 2 years or a year, yeah, whatever, and kind of just helped around the house and was like in the thick of it. And that was just like one of the most deeply transformative experiences of my life, because I found that, first of all, writing helped me get through it. That was like the only thing, I think. I just immediately was like, my instinct was always to write about what I was feeling. And second, I think it like just opened up this door of feeling the worst you can possibly feel, and then like coming back from that and being like, oh, life can still be good. And I wrote this essay in 2018 after my first season on the Hotshot Crew. Kim passed away in 2014. I found fire. I got into fire in 2016. And I wrote this essay called Happiness Despite Everything, or something to that effect. And it was me grappling with this idea that like I would have never found fire or been prepared for fire and the reality of it if Kim hadn't passed away. And like fire made me who I was or who I am, and helped me transform in ways that I would have never had I not found it. And it made me deeply, deeply happy in a way that I'd never experienced. And it was just so weird to grapple with the fact that like I would have never found fire if I had never had that experience of losing somebody and then dealing with like the sort of fallout of that, and being deep in grieving, and like and realizing that like you can overcome, like once you overcome, or not overcome those emotions, but once you sort of learn to coexist with those emotions, like you can still do, like life goes on. So I just like I hate though that adversity and that grief and that suffering is like often like the foundation of like some of the best writing and like some of the best sort of creative output, and also just in knowing who you are and like the resilience that you have. I wish that wasn't the case, but I think it will always be the case.
Yeah.
And I don't wish that on any 18-year-old, that they would experience like the amount of adversity that's needed to realize, to like build that confidence of like, oh, I went through this, therefore I can go through this. But that is really the core of what my 20s were to me, was like going through a bunch of hard shit, and then always using that hard shit as like in the back of my mind is like, oh, I did that, therefore I can do this.
Mhm.
And I'm so grateful for that. And I would recommend that if you can get those experiences in a sort of controlled manner in any way, like maybe it's through endurance sports, maybe it's through getting a summer on AmeriCorps, or like doing a summer of trail work, or, doing any of these things that are like sort of controlled resilience furnaces, then I would recommend it. But I don't know. I don't even know, because you can't even control this a lot of the time. I mean, I would have really, really, really preferred to not have experienced that level of grief at 23 and lost my
Right.
stepmom, but it happened. And I hate that that is really kind of the foundation of a lot of my creative output and my creative sort of path and my path towards building confidence. But
Yeah, the consequences of being human are bad things are going to happen at some point.
yeah,
Sometimes they're younger, sometimes they're older, sometimes they happen really young, and you kind of have a loss of innocence before you should. Have you read Sebastian Junger's book Tribe?
I have read a number of his books.
Okay.
Can you explain Tribe really quick? Was that the one where they went walking and they were walking?
It's about belonging and coming home, and talks a lot about during war, just kind of what happens psychologically to people. You're part
Yeah.
of the unit, and so you have a mission, you have a purpose, and then you come home, and all of a sudden the mission and purpose is kind of gone. And so that's why a lot of veterans struggle mightily because they don't have that same purpose in their life. And as a country, we don't really care about our veterans very much. They
Hmm.
come home, they serve, whether 2 years, 4 years, 15 years, probably not 15, probably an even year, but they come home and we don't have jobs for them. We don't really care.
Yeah.
There's not much there. But he also mentioned about post-traumatic stress disorder and how it is normal for people who go through intense trauma to experience that for months, weeks. And then after a while, there should be, unless there's some sort of maladaptation, it should kind of phase out and not become post-traumatic stress as much as it's more of like, he doesn't use these terms, but like a bad memory. So when I think about the intensity of bad things that have happened, like you have your trauma right off the bat, then after a while it becomes maybe a bad memory that you can talk about. But because through that you've found other ways to cope, to be part of things. You aren't defined by that thing that happened a long time ago. And he said the instances of post traumatic stress are going up dramatically in people who it's been years and years and years, and they're still really, really impacted by it. And that isn't necessarily as it should be. Again, I'm totally
Yeah.
paraphrasing here, but something about the community that welcomes you back, or what you find afterwards, if it's something that's purposeful, if it's something productive, if it's something that builds confidence, it reminds you or tells you who you are and that you can do this and what you're made of. And obviously that's going to waver. You're going to have successes and failures, but that reminder of who you're made of, what you're made of, and what you can do is a very powerful thing going forward. Did
Yeah.
you experience much post-traumatic stress or any sort of like trauma? And you've mentioned that you've kind of adapted and you've found positive avenues to be productive afterwards. But what was your experience like with some of that trauma and dealing with that?
I don't know. I don't know if I just haven't compartmentalized it as post-traumatic stress or what, but it never really I never identified it as that in my mind. And I think that's because I very quickly recognized that writing specifically was a way to like sort of reflect on what was happening and contextualize it, and I just kept doing that. I kept like reflecting and like figuring out how this can be sort of flipped into not necessarily a positive, but like how I could just think about it differently, whether that was in Fire or whether that was dealing with the grief of losing Kim. It was always just like a practice in reflection. And I really prioritized that because it was like really the only way, once I realized that this was helping me, it was the only way I could really like deal with the grief. So I did the same thing in Fire. And therefore I feel like I conceptualized all of those experiences really quickly. I like sort of reflected on them and connected them to other experiences that I'd had, and in some way somehow transcended it from feeling like a trauma to feeling like an experience that was meaningful in some way. And I only say that because, or I don't want to like pretend like I'm high and mighty. I don't know that I had experiences that were necessarily like, obviously losing my stepmom was really hard. And I think the hardest part was like the aftermath of like helping my little sisters through their grief while also actively grieving. But I don't know that I have like a trauma response to that
Mm.
memory. And I guess sometimes I think about ways that I screwed up and like things that I did that I didn't, I'm not like maybe necessarily proud of, but I was like 23 and like trying to act like a mom and like, or not like an authority figure
Mhm.
with kids that were deeply grieving, and I didn't have the tools for that. And so I do think back on ways that I like I'm like, man, if I would have known what I know now, I would have done that differently or had that conversation differently or helped them in a different way. But this all to say, I've been really grateful for writing. And I think a thing that I would like to do in the future is just like running writing workshops for people who maybe aren't experiencing post-traumatic stress. That doesn't seem like something I'm qualified for, but certainly like people who are going through the deep grief of like watching a family member succumb to cancer or succumb to terminal illness. Or I just think like writing has completely transformed the way that I experience the world and especially experience grief in those types of experiences. And so I want to share that. I just think it's such an important tool for that. And I think, yeah, that would be an interesting thing to pursue in the future is helping folks kind of use writing as a tool in that way.
In my journalism class, I've had students who have written about some of the things that they endured growing up, and I encourage them, don't share anything that you don't want to share, that you're not comfortable with, but this can be an opportunity for you to get something out that they could then help someone else. And
Yes.
it's such an incredibly difficult thing to then slap a grade on because the person is so unbelievably honest and you get a glimpse into what their life has been to this point, and you think, this is a 17-year-old kid who had to deal with this. And I'm going to give them an 89 because their punctuation or because they, misspellings or because, this is a little bit wordy here. Try to cut this stuff out. Man,
Yeah.
such a difficult thing to do. But it's good talking points to talk to kids and then clarify, say, hey, the voice in this, like there are many different ways to write, and there's structurally perfect, and the punctuation is fine, and it's exactly 600 words or whatever. And there's also the honesty is the value in it. It's not that it's ornate language. The honesty and the heart in there is incredibly valuable too. But yeah, it just seems so, I don't want to say inappropriate because it is for a class, but like to throw a grade on that is something that's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
How do you decide, or how are you going to decide how to give feedback, or what type of feedback to allow a kid to have their individual writing voice and say, hey, this is great? Some kids, they're kind of fragile and in their writing because they take the way they communicate as an indictment of, or if it's an uninteresting story, that means they live an uninteresting life. So how do you gauge that grading, or have you thought about that?
Yeah, I think it's going to be like an adapt as I go operation just to see kind of where they're at. And then also just adapting to each student individually and on their specific journeys. But I think it's going to be heavily dependent on kind of effort and spirit and ability to, yeah, I think I'll be grading on effort. I think I'll be grading on like just the interest that they take in a topic, the curiosity that they bring to a topic. And I have a syllabus that was made for me, so I'm just going to be working off of somebody else's syllabus, but it's a really good syllabus, and they're really cool writing assignments that I think will allow me the opportunity to kind of grade on what the assignment is intending to accomplish and not get their hopes completely, or not like dash their hopes by doing line edits on grammar or on punctuation, but really saying like, okay, the structure of this maybe could use some work, but I really like what you're doing. I really think you have some good, okay, what's that? I think you have like some cool, you're showing really good curiosity about this subject or about this assignment. I see that you've put the effort in to explore your mind a little bit and explore like how this relates to you in your life. And I think that's important. And like if they do it in a way that the structure doesn't really work, or the grammar is a little off, or the punctuation is certainly not right, or maybe the sentence structures are a little weird, or whatever it might be, if I can see that their effort is there, then I'm probably gonna, give them an adequate grade.
Yeah, the standards thing is interesting in that too, because people could say, "Oh, as long as you have good ideas and everybody gets an A," and we've seen that with COVID. During COVID, it was no kid gets a B during COVID. Everybody gets an A during COVID. It's like, well,
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that. There's some stuff going on, but we have to have some sort of standard. We have to hold the line somewhere.
I know.
But I think we do get caught up a little bit too much in the the things that don't matter as much. Grammar matters and structure matters, absolutely 100%. And you have to prove that did you read the excerpt? Did you read the essay? Have you shown that you understand what the author was
Yeah.
trying to say?
Yeah.
And then are you responding to that? Are you going off on some sort of just tangent thing? Like you have to be focused in that. But yeah, I think that creative expression is something that's really important, because that's going to be the thing that's not replaced by AI.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
and anybody who, if you use Chat GPT for everything, then you are making yourself so obsolete, because your individuality is the thing that you're outsourcing to Chat GPT, and that's really scary.
Yeah.
And that's something they got
Right.
to communicate to the kids.
Yeah, like we've been doing like a learning how to teach course this week for for TAs in the writing department, or in the English department. So I'm still learning. I still don't I really do think it's going to be like an adapt as I go thing. And yeah, I'm interested in seeing how engaged these students are going to be. And I think it will be. I don't think that I need to lower my standards. I think that there will be students who express curiosity and who express creative, or who express themselves with spirit and vigor, and the types of things I'm looking for, that I don't know how to explain it, but I think that there will be a hierarchy, or not a hierarchy, but there will be students who rise to the top in that way, and there will be students who don't put that same effort in. And I'm really hoping to try to reach some of those students and express the importance of creative thought and of individuality, and of, in the age of AI, like, I feel like I will never be obsolete, because I can express myself in a way that AI can't touch. And I'm so grateful for that. And I do hope to express that over the course of the semester, that, yeah, this ability to think critically, and to have curiosity, and to just be able to express yourself very in your unique way, in your own voice, regardless of whether you're going to be in engineering, or if you're going to go into the creative, into creative writing. Like, either way, these are important skills that people are going to be looking for more and more in the workforce, and already are. I mean, the amount of like communication and writing jobs, and even marketing and social media and that kind of stuff, that are desperately looking for people who have a unique voice, is only going to keep going up.
Mhm.
And yeah.
You've done copywriting, you've done your podcast, Life with Fire. Were all these things that were kind of something that you were kind of interested, maybe when you were in high school or in college? Did you think, oh, I like communicating, I like writing, or has all this kind of just kind of came to come to fruition the last couple of years?
Yeah, I actually I've been writing in a journal since I was in fourth grade, and I have all of my journals with me, hoping to sort of mine them for content over the next few months. But I have all my journals with me. It's a stack. It's like a 3 foot tall stack of journals. And I was looking at like my fourth grade journals the other day, and they're just like completely off the wall. This all to say, I have long been I've always been dedicated to like documenting my life. And I don't know where that came from. My parents are not like that at all. My parents are like, my dad's a plumber and my mom works at a plastic company. And like, there's no creativity in my family at all. And I wasn't even raised to be a reader. Like, I didn't really read until my stepmom Kim came around, and she was a teacher, and she was like, "Oh my God, you like aren't reading, and you're in third grade or second grade, and like you need to be reading." And so she would just like give me stacks of books, and I'm so grateful for that. But I had always been really interested in just like documenting and like taking photos and whatever. And so come ninth grade, I got into high school yearbook, and we had like a weirdly good yearbook at my high school, my rural high school in a town of 1,000 people. I graduated with 65 people. So it was a small, small high school, but we would put out these like incredible yearbooks, and we would go to like these yearbook conferences and like win awards for best yearbook for the school of our size. And so I was regularly traveling for these workshops or these conferences to win awards for this yearbook, and did it all 4 years of high school. And I still attribute that to my interest in writing, because I was doing sort of journalistic type work. I was like learning about deadlines. I was learning about writing headlines. I was learning about designing pages. I was learning about just all of these really foundational interviewing, all these foundational skills. And I used that as a means of getting a job at a newspaper when I first got into college. So I I was a freshman in college and I like met the sports editor of the local newspaper in Marquette, Michigan. And I asked him if he was interested in having a freelance writer. And he was like, sure, if you want to like come and cover a wrestling match every now and then or whatever, we'll take it. We'll pay you $15 an article. And I used my experience from high school yearbook to get that job. And then I ended up becoming like part-time for them. And that was then the reason I got into like magazine writing. And it's just like so funny to think about that, the stepping stones. But yearbook was like my first stepping stone. And I really like look back on that and I'm amazed that we had that program at this tiny little high school and that we had this really passionate instructor for it and that he had like these really nice cameras and he had the best computers and he was having all of us learn not only about writing and photography but also design and all of these foundational skills that I am so grateful to have learned at a formative age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really important to not shut stuff down when you're a freshman or a sophomore in high school and you think, well, I don't like this. I'm not going to need to know this. Like, you have no idea. It's good to explore this because this might manifest into something that you don't even know about yet. But you head down this road a little bit. I'm not really into yearbook, but now those skills can be applied in something that you're really interested in. So I think one of the things that I've seen a lot more in my teaching career are kids who show up knowing for sure that they don't need to know this, rather than, man, I hate this, but I'll get my C or I get my D and I'll move on with my life. It's, I don't need to know this. I know for sure that I don't need to. And then also, I'm not interested in this when the problem could not be that maybe it's not the content. It could be that you have a problem with work. And that's a bothersome sort of thing. There's some kids who they say that they really like, I'm more interested in science, or I'm more interested in autos, or I'm more interested in maritime. Well, why do you have a 15% in that class too? Like the real problem here could be a work issue and not just an interest type thing. And so how can we get you to a point where you can be productive? But that's educational theory. We don't even have to go down that road there.
Yeah,
you also like fly fishing, right? Did you
Yep.
have a thought there? I was going to transition to fly fishing there.
No, I just have nothing but respect for high school teachers and for like the ability to sort of see an interest and then kind of like keep pushing somebody in that direction, or like introducing teenagers to things that just teaching them how to be curious, teaching them that like to try new things and like trying to engage them in different things, even though they think they're bad at it. Like, I have nothing but respect for that. That seems complicated. Anyway.
That's tough. All right. So we're coming up on an hour here. So I had some questions about management practices, but we're already at an hour. So do you want to reschedule and talk about that later, or you want to get into some of the management stuff now as far as healthy forests and burning and all that stuff?
Oh, man. I could talk about that now. Maybe only one or two questions, though.
Okay. Well, broad open one just to start here, because you have obviously learned about this through experience. And then since then, you've been doing a lot of podcast stuff. So even though your career as a hotshot is probably over, maybe over, you've still been very engaged in the information. You're kind of on the intellectual side of this. What is the difference maybe in like a clean, healthy burn versus a very intense, bad burn? And what about our current management, probably more so in the lower 48, because Southeast Alaska is a rainforest, so we don't have the same, it's a little bit different there. But the difference between the burns and then what is a management thing that needs to maybe get more traction so that we can see maybe fewer of these really intense, bad wildfires?
Yeah. My first thought is just that like, it's so easy for all of us to get trapped in this idea that what works in our area works across the board, across ecosystems. And I think that's something that the public gets trapped in a lot, is just thinking like, this is the only way to manage forests. And it's like, well, there's a lot of different types of forests and there's a lot of different ways to manage forests. And there's a lot of different ways that fires interact with different forests and landscapes, I should say, sagebrush or sage steppe, like desert, there's a lot of different ecosystems where fire interacts with those places a little differently. So I think that's the first thing I would say, is just that I like to encourage people to just better understand how fire interacts with their specific ecosystem in their backyard. It can literally be it can be as micro as a drainage, the way that a drainage would interact with fire. And so fire is not unanimously bad in any capacity. across the board, because some ecosystems do need high severity fire that kind of just like nukes off the entire landscape. Like some ecosystems just simply burn like that. And so it's hard to say that that's bad, because that is technically how it's supposed to burn or how it's long burned. And then, of course, some places burn more at that low to moderate severity. Like dry conifer ecosystems are generally considered low, moderate severity wildfire regimes, where you have more fire, but it's often just not very intense. It's kind of creeping around in the underbrush, not burning trees, as much. And then the reason we're having problems is because a lot of our ecosystems have sort of transcended beyond what you would historically have seen. So especially in dry conifer ecosystems, so like the Sierra, or like, timbered areas of eastern Washington, timbered areas of Montana, of like western Montana, a number of other places. In those places, we're seeing a lot more trees because we have removed fire from those landscapes. Fire would have traditionally kind of kept a certain amount of tree density in these forests that traditionally were not very overgrown. Now they're overgrown. Now they burn more intensely. That's not great. So that's an example of a fire like kind of burning outside of its historical norms. And that's the kind of thing we're trying to reduce through kind of like proactive management. And that is coming in and taking some of that tree density out mechanically, which people hate because it looks like logging. It's called like fuels treatments or fuels projects, or, reducing fuels by coming in with chainsaws, or coming in and doing effectively what looks like logging in these stands in order to bring the density back down to what it historically would have been. People have a problem with that. I can understand why. I can understand that it looks, it feels weird to like cut trees. Everyone's kind of obsessed with trees. We romanticize trees, and we're like, no, we need more trees, right? Like trees are good for they reduce carbon in the atmosphere. They do this, that, and the other thing, and they're really important. When in fact, in some of these ecosystems, it's like, no, trees are the problem. Trees are very much the problem. And if you look at historical images of these dry conifer ecosystems, a lot of the time you're looking at, significantly less tree cover than we have now. So there's your problem in that ecosystem. And then there's other places have different relationships with fire. But I really encourage people to better understand how their specific ecosystem relates to fire. I can't remember the other part of your question, but I think that the biggest thing is just, the importance of active management in certain places, and, and that means removing density. That means taking out small spindly trees, or maybe even mature trees in some places where it's determined that wildfire risk is high, or extreme wildfire risk is high. And then I think as far as like policy goes, I think more of that active management in places that need it is important. And then the secondary, maybe I have 3 points. Second part of this is just improving resilience at the community scale, and really prioritizing reducing fuels near communities specifically, and especially so in like really dense forests. So like I think about like the Western Cascades are really dense, have a lot of people living in these valleys that are really susceptible to high severity wildfire. I think the Labor Day fires are a really good example of what this looks like. That was the 2020 onslaught of multiple large fires burning east to west in various drainages in Oregon and the West Cascades. And these are really highly populated drainages. And the same goes for Washington State. And I think Washington State is Western Washington it's only a matter of time before we have a similar event there, where we have existing, this is getting really nitty gritty, but where you have an onslaught of fire behavior, and you have like the perfect conditions to sort of create a catastrophic wildfire scenario, which was what happened in the Labor Day fires. And in those scenarios, like the best thing we can do is remove fuel from around communities in some sort of strategic way, where you're like strategically protecting neighborhoods, you're strategically protecting infrastructure, because in those places you can't remove a lot of vegetation because it just keeps growing back. And it's the West Cascades. It's wet. It's basically a rainforest, and it's just going to keep coming, and you're going to have to keep doing it every year if you're going to do it. So like in those places, you can't just start removing trees, because that's not going to do much. That all to say, I just think, like prioritizing more resilience at the edges of communities. And then the third one is just changing our relationship with fire, or rather our perception of wildfire, so that we can use tools in our toolbox that feel sort of risky, especially to folks who don't have like a firm grasp on kind of wildfire operations. But I'm talking about things like using fire, using managed fire. In many cases, you can sort of use existing wildfires to benefit the landscape and to kind of do as they would have historically done, especially so in wilderness areas, especially so in places that are pretty far from communities and things at risk. But they're still going to put up a lot of smoke, and they're still going to like get a lot of attention. And so I think just trying to sort of start shifting the public perception of wildfire away from it's like unanimously catastrophic to sometimes it's acceptable, and sometimes in fact we really need it, and sometimes we can actually use wildfires as a means of treating acres that really need to be treated. So that's the nitty-gritty for you.
Yeah, it's really tough because the Forest Service being a government agency, that means that anything in a local area, like regionally, has to then go through DC.
Yeah,
So it doesn't even if you look regionally, a region like the Pacific Northwest is made up of a whole bunch of different types of ecosystems. And so when
exactly.
you ask for like public comment, you could have someone rolling up with some sort of idea about how forests should be managed in California, and you're applying it to Washington or Alaska, and it
Exactly.
doesn't make sense. So you have every right, and you should speak up because it is public comment. That is your right. But do
Mm-hmm.
you know what you're talking about and how much of the stuff it makes it so difficult? My wife works for the Forest
It
Service
does.
up here, and she's an ecologist, and so much of the management and so much of just the ideas of what the Forest Service should be doing is derived from models that aren't necessarily applicable here. And it just
Mm-hmm.
makes it so frustrating. And the problem is that rather than like the career politician types in DC, people locally get upset at the local Forest Service people as if it's like Abby is the one who is not cutting the firewood for the cabins, or Abby is not cutting the trails. It's like, hold on a second there. You have different departments and you have different levels of funding. And even like from the very beginning of the Forest Service, when it was first created, a lot of business interests wanted to starve it so that it failed, so that they could get with more business interests. But yeah, it's a crazy complex thing. It's got to be pretty frustrating to know so much about it and try to communicate it, but you might feel like you're just screaming into the void.
Yeah. Well, I will say the deeper I get, the more I realize I don't know. And
Mm.
I'm just like I'm like constantly blown away at how many things I don't know about in this world, and how like I could really keep this podcast running for like decades probably, just based on the amount of people doing really interesting work in this space. But yeah, the Forest Service thing is funny because it feels like this monolith, and it's so easy to just paint the entire agency as this like horrible bureaucratic whatever. And then yet I like know like some of the best people I know work for the Forest Service. And I like really respect the work of a lot of the people that are like really trying to fight some of these things from the inside out. And it's like it's yeah, it's weird to see it painted so negatively, and then to like know people who work for the agency who are just spectacular humans who are doing like the best that they can with what they have, and often what they have is much less than they need. And yeah, it's like that perception is really interesting to me, and I don't know that I can speak to it much more, but I just think like it's so easy for the public to paint the Forest Service as this monolith, and then they like meet somebody from the Forest Service that like lives in their community and works in their backyard, and it just like kind of humanizes it. But yeah, I don't know.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So in closing here, where can people find you? Where can people find your writing, listen to the podcast, subscribing, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I think most of it can be found on my website, which is just my name, amandamontheil.com. And yeah, everything that I do ends up there at some point. So it's a good place to find me. And then Life with Fire podcast is available on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to just yap.
It's
I
fun being
have
on the
not
other side
yapped this
sometimes.
much.
As a host, you kind of ask the question and then let people go, and then when you're a guest, it becomes a whole different experience.
And you're like very good at listening and just like letting me go. I appreciate that, but I recognize that I need to get better at like wrangling myself a little bit, because sometimes I just go off the rails and I can't stop myself. So,
No, that's great.
yeah,
That's great stuff.
cool.
Thanks again for being on here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.